Okay, so we have been making our way through the Gospel of Mark. Today we really kind of approach the last section, a reminder that we are in a part of the Gospel that historically is thought to be a later edition. The earliest copies of the book of Mark that have been found do not include these endings. We looked at the shorter ending last week. Today we look at, or maybe we look at part of, we'll see how far we get, what's called the longer ending of Mark. And this ending is attributed by several manuscripts. So there are multiple copies of Mark, though they're not thought to be the earliest copies, but there are multiple copies of Mark that include this or a version of the ending, though early on in the church, it was noted that there were some people suspicious of this ending as not original. So very early on, it was kind of noted that this seemed to be something that had been added, and it has been preserved. And I would say in no way does it go against the grain of Mark. I would say in no way is it, it would not have been accepted. It would not have been maintained if it spun off in some offensive direction or anything like that. There's nothing wrong with this, but it is worth noting that we think that it doesn't come from the actual original gospel. So we start here in verse 9. Now, after Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him, while they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. I don't think there's any actual tie to these two stories, Michael, but this is very sort of reminiscent of the Thomas story in other gospels, where Thomas makes an appearance, that Jesus has appeared to the other disciples. Thomas shows up and he says, I haven't seen it. I won't believe it. And here we have this original telling to Mary, and then Mary goes to take this good news, and those who haven't seen it are unable to believe it, or those who at least are in their grief, still mourning, are unable to accept good news, which I do think resonates with lots of Markan themes.
Yeah, it is not surprising, not only that they don't believe, that is a theme that happens throughout the book, but also the fact that it is Mary Magdalene is unto itself sort of a nod to the fact that this isn't Peter who's going back and reporting to them, right? And there's a sense in which she is the authoritative witness, and that witness is not being received. And once again, I think this plays back to a theme that we had before. Is it's a call to self-reflection on some level, and that is, will you believe the thing that you have heard, right? As the reader, will we believe the witness that has come to us, or will we be like the disciples, caught up in our own grief and mourning, and will we miss the resurrection of the Christ? And we're going to actually see a version of that here in the next couple verses as well. It's I think weighs upon the sans sort of repeated themes that we have in the book.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this this ending narrative is that it kind of comes to us in almost like acts of a play. So we have first an individual encounters the good news, and then secondly, in verse 12, we continue. After this, Jesus appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking into the country, and they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe him. Now, a possible link to this story is found in another gospel, where there's the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, and there's this relatively complex story of what could be linked to this reference, though that may not be, it may be reading too much into it, because Mark gives us really no clue about who they are, where they are. It gives us no version of the conversation that they have. And yet now we have two witnesses who go back again to the disciples, and again the disciples are unable to hear this new news.
Right. I think Luke has the Road to Emmaus story,
Correct.
which this seems to, at least resonate with. And yeah, Clint, I don't really have much to add other than that telling in Luke is one of my favorite stories. So I have to just confess to everybody here, I insert it here like a footnote, and for that reason, I like it.
Yeah. Okay, so now we've had a single witness. Now we've had two witnesses. Now we have Jesus encountering the disciples, or the disciples encountering Jesus. So verse 14, later he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table. And he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved. The one who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. By using my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes in their hands. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover. So an interesting footnote on this. First of all, we see here Jesus critiquing the disciples. And in some ways, this is in keeping with the Jesus that we have seen throughout this gospel, who is frustrated by lack of belief. We see that in all the gospels. Though I can't think necessarily, Michael, I can't think of the equivalent scene in another gospel where Jesus scolds the disciples. Nothing comes to mind to me that's a parallel.
Maybe Peter and John, possibly.
I mean, he gets after Thomas slightly, perhaps, but there's no parallel to this that I'm aware of, where Jesus scolds the whole bunch of them for their lack of faith and stubbornness. Typically, when one encounters the risen Christ in the other gospels, that is a turning point. That's a moment of inspiration. That's a moment of confidence, and where they sort of come into the knowledge of the truth, and it changes them. It's very interesting. And for whatever else we could say about this ending, I think it's very much in keeping with Mark, that here, even seeing Jesus seems to be not the end of their struggle. And Mark, seems to consistently, the Gospel of Mark seems to consistently portray a faithful life as a deep challenge to all of us. And so here, Jesus confronts them, but then he sends them an abbreviated version of what we see in the Gospel of Matthew. Go into the world and proclaim the good news. And there's this sense that it now rests with them. The one who believes will be saved. The one who doesn't will be condemned. And then we have this list of signs. These were important to the early church. They've remained important to a segment of the church throughout our history, though there have been times, especially for groups that read these words literally, the bit about snakes and poisons, that these verses have been problematic. They have done damage to well-meaning people who thought that they, in reading these words literally, were being told that if one had enough faith, they couldn't be harmed by dangerous things. And unfortunately, that is most often not the case. And so these words are, in one way, a beautiful promise. On another way, they've been problematic in our history.
There's a sense in which Luke and Matthew, in particular, and there's some sense in which this is true in John as well, that these other gospels have built into them the application, the so what of Jesus. And in Mark, I don't want to paint with too large of a brush here, too broad of a brush, but it seems to me that what we have here is the church trying to put some application to what otherwise was a not very applicable ending, right? The idea that these bewildered, trembling women flee from the tomb because they're afraid, that doesn't really inspire a whole lot of action for those that receive this letter. That's a really strange place to leave it. So what we have here is this sort of take home. The one who believes will be baptized, and that's a physical act. They'll be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. And then you have these signs, the driving out of demons, speaking in tongues, picking up snakes, drinking poison, placing hands on people, them getting well. There's a physical, tactile application to this kind of language. And I think you're right, Clint, to point out that different interpretations and readings of Scripture have led the church down different roads in the past. Some have taken these words very literally. Some have taken these words more spiritually. But regardless of where you have been in the history of the church, the idea that we can just move forward in life and that we can do so without our lives being impacted by the gospel is, I think, what's squarely in mind here, is that fundamentally the disciple's life will be transformed in a meaningful way. And, I think especially in the Reformed tradition, we've at times been accused of things like being the frozen chosen. And I think there's a sense in which we also should be reminded that the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, him resurrected, will have an impact on our lives. It'll transform not just what we think, but how we behave. And that it is fair for us to examine ourselves and to see how that works. I think maybe to some extent, I'm thinking of some of the themes from the Pastor Talk podcast, the spiritual practices discussions that we had. I think there's a sense in which if we could insert some of those practices in here, I think it would be in keeping with the spirit of the text.
I think there's a kind of bad news, good news in this text, and deal with the bad news first. The bad news is, and we've had some of this conversation in regard to the healing stories that we've seen. Unfortunately, where we took this well-meaning text was to use these callings as a kind of litmus test for the faith. And the problem in that is that whenever they fail, the out is that the person who fails with them or is affected doesn't have enough faith. And somewhere along the line, that became a club and not an encouragement. Here, this is clearly an encouragement to the church to move into the world unafraid and to embody the work of Jesus Christ. And what it becomes instead is a kind of treadmill on which if you don't believe, if you believe enough, you won't get sick and you won't get hurt and you can do these amazing things. And when you can't, it's your own fault. So it sets up a kind of inevitable shortcoming for people of faith and for traditions that have taken that path. I think it has been very, very difficult. Now, I would not count Presbyterians necessarily in that path, though I think we all wrestle with these themes at some point. Historically, Presbyterians didn't read these words literally. And the downside in that is that we sometimes miss the bridge that happens here. The most amazing thing about all of these things that are listed is that they assume that the church is now going to continue what Jesus was doing. What Jesus did, what we saw Jesus do while he was on earth, we should now see the church doing. Proclaiming good news, working for healing, being courageous, confronting abuses of power, confronting religious hypocrisy. And when we read these, like, well, can we handle snakes or can we do faith healing? I really think, Michael, that we kind of rob the theme of some of its power, and we unfortunately take something that is a giant calling and invitation, and we sort of boil it down to these almost tasks at which we cannot succeed.
Yeah, I think in that vein, and Ian, to respond directly to your comment, I think the word in this text that matters is in verse 17. These signs will accompany those who believe. What's at stake is, what is the nature of our belief? What do we put our belief in? And I think an unfortunate sort of turn that happens in modern Christianity is we start to conceive of faith as a intangible currency that one can have more of or less, and that it can, by the power of how much exists, call something into reality. It can make something happen in the world. And that is the farthest thing from the core theme of Mark, which has been that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, announcing the kingdom of God in authority and power. When we come to a text like verse 17 and it talks about those who believe, you have to look at the entire book that comes before it and realize what we're called to have faith in is not some intangible currency to sort of work into ourselves a feeling of trust, but rather a firm and resolute commitment to the reality of Jesus Christ, crucified, dead, buried, and resurrected, and the reality that the kingdom that life, death, resurrection represents is the one in which we are taking part by our living. And that is a substantially different understanding of what it means to have faith. So in the one setting, it makes sort of coherent sense to say, well, if I have enough faith, then this will happen. In the other, it makes absolutely no sense, because you can't have more or less faith that is going to somehow affect these changes in your life. It's, do you trust Jesus? Do you trust him at his word? Because if you do, then everything else will follow. And that's really the entire sort of backbone of this book, is to provide us with the information that we need to have faith, to put our trust, to believe in the person of Jesus Christ. And then I think, where we always get fixated by nature of being human is, well, what does that mean for me? What's the application? What's the simple takeaway? And when we read the words that follow about all the stuff that we can do and all the ways that we can sort of live out our life in response to the gospel, we become fixated on that stuff and we lose focus on the one who we're called to believe in. And that's the fundamental error of faith.
Yeah, and the only thing I think that I would add to that, Michael, is that in a tradition like ours, it would be easy to read these things that are miraculous in nature, that are historically more within the circle of Pentecostal, charismatic, spiritualist traditions, and say, oh, that's not the way that we do it. Well, the thing that we'd miss in that is that wherever the gospel is followed, there are to be signs. There are to be evidences. Now, we would point to a different set of evidences than some of our brothers and sisters in other faith traditions. But the clear idea of the gospel is that following Jesus ought to be manifest in some experiential way, some conformational way in the community. Now, we could talk about relationships being strengthened. We could talk about people being able to forgive those who have wronged them. We could talk about lives being changed. We could talk about marriages being saved. We could talk about lots of things. We probably would not have a conversation about poisonous serpents and drinking poison, but the point still remains underneath of the text, that where the gospel is proclaimed and followed, there will be signs of the work of Christ.
Yeah, I do think that that's a helpful word, Clint. I do think as Presbyterians, we do sometimes land very firmly on the side of grace, and we miss the opportunity to receive the invitation to works. And that's a fine, fine line. One that we tried to walk, I think, when we studied James together, a book that really portrays that, I think, helpfully. I will say, from someone who who has historically lived in a more spiritualist tradition, I think we as Reformed people should not underestimate the power of using the gifts that we have in more traditional means, and the difference it makes. In other words, to make that clear, there are a lot of hospitals around the country with the name Presbyterian, and we are currently in a moment where we have a lot to be grateful for those who are serving in those hospitals. So, and the fact that God can work healing in lots of ways is something I think we should celebrate. And though Presbyterians have historically not had a big tent revivals and laying out of hands, I think we should celebrate the ways in which we have sought to bring about healing in the world. And I'm not saying something new, Clint. I think I'm just reiterating a point you made earlier.
Yeah, I think the way that I might say it, Michael, is that while we would talk about these quote unquote manifestations in different language, so instead of casting out demons, we might say confronting evil. Instead of, laying hands on the sick, we might talk about bringing comfort and compassion and working to heal in the biggest sense of the word. And I would only hate for any of us from any tradition to read this part of the gospel and not feel challenged by it, instead somehow passing it off as, well, my church doesn't do those things. That would be a disservice, I think, to the text. And Ian is proving once again the depth of his reformational approach. Ian, my Calvinist theology professor, would be giving you an A right now. We give ourselves too much credit. That would be well received in the classes of my youth. That's a good point. I think maybe what we can do, Michael, if you're okay with this, let's leave the ascension for tomorrow, and we will include with it a kind of some reflection on Mark's place and maybe a summary of what we think we've covered to this point.
My final word for today, then, Clint, is going to be this. It's fascinating to me. A lot of church controversies have been drawn from these last words of Mark. There's been a lot of debates about baptism from these words, from the reference here in verse 16. There's been a lot of debates about the things that we see in verses 17 to 18. I think it's just striking to me when you get to the end of Mark and there's sort of this so what being answered, how tempted we are as humans to make it about us and our debates and our understanding, and that we turn the light away from the one who's been the entire subject of these words for 16 chapters. I think that's the beauty of going on a study throughout the entire book like we've done together, is you get to the end and it's like the guardrails at the bowling alley, right? Once you put those up, it's going to help you keep the ball in the lane, because if you just dropped into here and you just started to read it and study it, you might be tempted to take this in a direction that I don't think is helpful in any way. And I think reading this in light of the book that we know has come before it is an important interpretive sort of conviction.
Yeah, and for those who have been with us throughout most of Mark, I think you can hear a difference. I think even though this longer ending is well written and has some good stuff in it, I think you can very clearly hear the communal nature of it. This has the sound of something that comes from the church and becomes immediately more about the church's life than did Mark's proclamation of the sort of single-focused spotlight on the person and work of Jesus. And that's an important transition. That transition has to happen. That's most of the book of Acts. And all of the Gospels do that to some extent. But I think if you compare this ending with what we've already seen in Mark, you can hear a little difference of where they come from. And we can talk more about that tomorrow if anyone has questions about that. I may have just totally pulled that out of the air, and it may not be true, but that's what I think.
And that'll be the last word. We'll see you tomorrow, friends.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. Find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So, until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.